Welcome everybody in person and welcome everybody online. My name is Ben Worthy. I'm the director of the Centre for British Political Life here at Birkbeck, and I'm part of the School of the Social Sciences, and I want to welcome you to the second event in this fortnight of the Social Sciences Festival after a tremendous event last night hosted by Jan. So we're here to talk about the two issues of reparations and aid. Now, reparations and aid in some senses are interlinked, and they are kind of part of one of the biggest global conversations of the 21st century. Hilary Beckles described reparations as the great tide of the early 21st century. Now, if we'd been having this conversation 6 months ago, I'd have probably been able to kind of paint you a much more positive picture than the one we're looking at now, particularly in terms of reparations, which has become a global transnational movement, which has turned the tide of the traditional idea of reparations, which was often something imposed by victors or the powerful on the powerless. And in the last few decades, it's turned into an issue around global justice, equality, and linked to very contemporary issues like climate change, as we saw in the recent Commonwealth meetings with Keir Starmer. Similarly with foreign aid, it seemed, at least until, again, a few months ago, that the idea of aid and assistance was kind of lodged firmly in the global economy, and lots of countries were on the way to, if not meeting, the UN stated target of 0.7% of GDP turned into foreign aid. The problems arrived, as many have done, in January 2025. I don't really need to rehearse what's happening in the US with aid at the minute, but as a reminder, in his first day in office, Donald Trump effectively dismantled US aid. 83% of all its operations were cut almost instantly, and Boston College estimated that this could cause the loss of 250,000 lives just by the end of 2025. The real difficulty is that, especially due to Ukraine, other Western European countries have followed suit. Belgium, France, and Netherlands have all slashed their aid budgets, and particularly the UK that slashed its aid budget by 40%. In terms of reparations, I don't actually know what Donald Trump thinks about reparations. I did Google it, and the only two stories came up were that he would like reparations for American victims of Biden's migrant crisis, and that he would also like to put back the Confederate statues. So with this kind of bleak introduction, I want to hand over to my far more esteemed panel to talk about these kind of interlinked issues. And we have a really wonderful set of speakers here to celebrate the Social Sciences Week. We have Professor Patricia Daley from Oxford University, Sophia Price, who is the head of School of Social Sciences here at Birkbeck, and Professor Karen Wells, also of the School of Sciences, Social Sciences at Birkbeck College. They each represent different areas of expertise. Professor Daley is a human geographer. Professor Price deals with politics and international relations, and Professor Wells deals with international development in childhood. So how we're going to run it from now on is I'm going to ask each of the speakers to speak for approximately 10 minutes or so. And then after that, I was going to open it up to Q&A from you. So people in the room, I'm afraid you have to save your questions until the end of the presentations. People online, you have the luxury of being able to type questions whenever you wish in the chat. And what I'll do afterwards is take questions from the room and then online in kind of alternate phases. So without further ado, I'll move from the far side of the room to this end. So first, Professor Daley.
Good evening, everyone. I am delighted to be here, and thanks to Jan over there and Ben Worthy for the invitation to participate in this evening's panel. I don't work on reparations, but I work on reparative justice. The case for reparations, as far as I'm concerned, is non-negotiable. I just want to give you 5 reasons how, as a social scientist, I have sought to address reparative justice with respect to the violence of slavery and colonialism and neo-colonialism. The first point I want to make is that the issue of reparations is central to the recognition and restitution of the enslaved people and their descendants as full human beings. Right? This is obviously of great importance at the current conjuncture, as Ben stated, as white supremacists have returned to the political center in the West, and blatant anti-blackness becomes acceptable in public and policy discourse. There, as far as I'm concerned, as an academic, remains an imperative to document and reveal further the scale of the injustices, extreme violence, genocides, crimes against humanity, including the destruction of productive capacities, knowledge systems, and ways of being in the world. So a number of books have been published recently comparing the Holocaust, a Jewish Holocaust, the horrors of the Holocaust, to that of African enslavement. And in the same way that the Jews were compensated for the Holocaust, Africans and the people of African descent deserve to be compensated. And I can put some figures later for those who are unaware of the Jewish compensation. As you might also be aware, the owners, slave owners, were compensated. Some 20 million pounds were put aside in 1834 to pay compensation. So the slave owner, a guy called Peter Daley, who owned the plantation on which my family descended, received compensation and bought a castle in Ireland called Daley Castle. We renamed it Daley Castle. It's now ruins. In so research by social scientists have shown that the German genocide against the people of Southwest Africa and Namibia was a precursor to that of the Holocaust. And we know that the Germans learned racial segregation from the Americans and exchanged ideas on race science. The second point I want to make around reparative justice, which means recognizing that colonial genocidal practices and their logics did not cease after the ending of slavery and colonialism. Critical social science has revealed and can continue to reveal colonial continuities in the retention and promotion of economic extractive practices, which are militarized, racialized, and linked to the characterization of African peoples as non-human. Colonial continuities are also evident in the continuation of state institutions that are predisposed to discrimination and genocide. This is exemplified by the training of militaries for the domestic control of citizens in so-called post-colonial countries, the continued supply of weapons and military training to such states, and I work on African states, and the regional expansion of warfare through the transfer of genocidal ideas relating to the conduct of war. I argue also, and we should note that colonial persistence is evident in the geopolitics of knowledge production and coloniality that requires the devaluation of indigenous knowledge and obedience to Western scientific knowledge and pedagogies, thus maintaining the epistemic violence associated with asymmetrical correlations with former colonies, whiteness, military supremacy, and the hegemony of Western development trajectories. In this book, my colleague Amber Murray and I published what's a couple of years ago, Learning Disobedience, Decolonizing Development Studies, we seek to inspire people to practice critical interdisciplinary scholarship, thinking beyond genocidal capitalist practices, and imagine and work towards just futures. That point I want to make is reparative justice and scholarship means campaigning, also being involved activism for the abolition of or transformation of global institutions, such as the World Bank and the IMF, and their support for racial extractive capitalism. And it means researching and scrutinizing the unfair trade agreements that continue to impoverish people in the global south. It means documenting and campaigning against capital flights from Africa and other genocidal practices. Some of you might be familiar with the work of Leon Sendikumana and James Boyce, who have estimated that since 1970, capital flight from Africa amounted to $2 trillion US, of which 600 billion exited after the turn of this century. And they're right, if we include the interest income that would have been earned from these outflows, the cumulative amount of private wealth in offshore bank entities stood at 2.4 trillion by 2018. This is money that Africans could have access to, and British territories of some of the main offshore banks and investment companies. So one of the reparative justice means addressing the illegal funds which are held in UK banks, often, as I said, in offshore accounts, but not exclusively. And finally, the other thing I think we should, with regards to trade agreement, one of the, there's always a talk, and I think Minister of State for International Development said recently that Britain isn't a global charity or something along those lines. But when you look at the trade agreements, right, that Britain, the European Union, and now the US under Trump have signed with Africa, right, it means that money is more money, and a number of studies, including Leon's Ndikumana and Boyce, have shown that more Africa is a net creditor to the rest of the world. More money is coming from Africa to Britain than is going in the charity that Britain, or the aid that Britain provides. And I hope my colleagues will nuance aid for those of you who are not familiar with what aid actually means. And finally, for me, reparative justice means engaging in anti-racist practices that seek to abolish the carceral system in our societies, particularly that devalues Black lives, the violence of anti-Blackness, and the intergenerational harm that they produce. Failure to recognize Africans as full human beings have resulted, as I said, to the return to the right to the center of Western politics. History is now, it is in the making. And there's no point in saying that later on someone or an institution will be seen as being on the wrong side of history. We have to prevent them from being on the wrong side of history. And I just want to point out, in respect to development aid, critical social scientists have been pointing out for a long time the problems with aid, the corrupt nature of aid. I have done research in many African countries, and I've been exposed to the class-based, race-based, gender-based injustices that have come with aid. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Daley. And now over to Professor Sophia Price.
Thanks. I'm going to have to manage a laptop and a microphone, which is probably one too many things for me. I think I might need to hold that in a minute, but then I'll see what I can do. So it's lovely to be here, and thanks very much to everyone for coming. Thanks to Ben for organising, Karen, Patricia, it's lovely to be here. I'm a political economist, and my research area is part of my research area is looking at development cooperation relations, particularly between European Union and UK and Africa. So I'll speak to some of the things that Patricia was just saying. Ben's asked us to kind of reflect on our own research here. So that's what I'll focus on here. And when we're talking about development cooperation relations, we're looking at the twin tools of aid and trade. And just as Patricia said, I think it's impossible, and it should be impossible, for us to have a critical engagement with the politics of aid without understanding the politics of trade and production, without locating that within an in-depth analysis of the global economy, how that's structured by colonialism and coloniality, and how those in turn help us to understand global systems of capitalist accumulation. So for me, it's important that we understand aid within that framing. And that then informs my own position, which is a bit more pessimistic about reparative justice, because I think the format of reparative justice can only be achieved by whole-scale institutional and structural reform of the global economy, and that's a very big ask. We know that there's kind of ongoing critiques of aid. Obviously, there's been historic critiques of aid, and we can look to authors such as Nkrumah, who talk to us about aid as credit recycling, the way in which aid donation provided benefits primarily to the donor by linking aid provision to infrastructural development projects in the recipient state and the like. We also obviously can talk about aid as coercion and control, and analysis of consensus, post-Washington consensus tells us about how the role of aid in fashioning structural adjustment and the kind of coercive practices around that. And that kind of brings us up to the contemporary moment, where the aid regime is characterized by financialization and securitization. We see increasingly development aid as being part of partnerships that help to secure private investment in other parts of the world to de-risk investments in places where private capital would find it difficult to go alone. So development aid is part of a kind of blending mechanism that links public funding to private profit making. We also see aid in terms of securitization, about ways in which European state, America, UK, how they use aid in order to prevent migration. And that's particularly framed in narratives of protecting domestic populations from the other. And we understand that in kind of narratives, policymaking narratives in terms of value for money. How can we ensure value for money from aid? Well, it keeps British people or European people safe from the other. And that kind of changing dialogues around aid is reflective of also a change in public attitude towards aid. We see a very right-wing agenda around aid donation that has fed into the policies of Trump, where we say, well, we no longer want to give aid. But that's not a recent phenomenon. We see in the UK that has been a particular feature of Tory party politics. Rees-Mogg delivered a petition to Theresa May in 2016 saying that we shouldn't be giving aid anymore. So there has been a real public move away from aid, particularly driven by conditions of crisis. But that also has fed into, or has been allied to, those very left-wing critical debates about aid. And that is a problematic moment, because we see this kind of crucial alliance between right-wing politics, racist politics, aligning with left-wing critical debates, appropriating the language of left-wing debates in order to push forward anti-progressive agendas. And the result of that is we've seen a move away from the 0.7% GNI commitments, not only in the UK, but across Europe. And that's not a recent phenomenon. That has been going on for decades. Ever since there was that commitment, there has been a rolling back of that commitment. Now, we can say, hurrah, if you say, well, we shouldn't be giving aid, then it's great that we're not giving aid. But in turn, we need to then recognise that the retraction of aid has particular impact on vulnerable sections of communities. In particular, women and girls are hit by the retraction of aid, the move away from healthcare and education. So the retraction away from aid has very particular gendered and classed impacts. That sort of then brings us to thinking about, well, how can we understand aid in the context of reparations? Now, reparations and reparative justice means more than just monetary transfers. There's a vast range of demands that can be put together with calls for reparative justice. And there's a whole range of reasons, kind of technical, normative, practical reasons against using aid as reparative justice. There's all sorts of reasons why trying to put the aid budget to work to achieve reparative justice is problematic. But we do see this new wave of activism of radical politics calling for reparative justice and allying that to a kind of call for monetary transfers and a kind of reconditioning of aid. But those political movements are not lacking their own internal contradictions. There's lots of conflict within those calls, those radical movements for reparative justice. And that's also been met with quite a lot of resistance from donors. There's not been this kind of engagement and embrace of reparative politics, reparative justice. There has been some expressions of regret and remorse and sorrow, but there hasn't been these kinds of payouts. And I think for me, this particular moment of radicalism around reparative justice calls to mind for me a previous moment where there was a similar kind of radicalism in the 1970s around the call for a new international economic order. That was a collective movement of actors from the global south who were trying to effect structural change in the global economy. And that was a movement also that was had its own inherent contradictions and ultimately was lacking. And I think probably that is an important warning sign for us to look back at history and to see what happened in the 1970s to the new international economic order and to understand why that failed to achieve the radical demands that it wanted to achieve, and what can we learn from this moment of political movement around reparative justice in order to learn from previous mistakes. And what we saw around the new international economic order was a tendency for development cooperation relations to appropriate the language of social justice, to take on and co-opt those radical agendas, not ultimately to bring transformation of the global economy, but actually to reinforce those orthodox tendencies. And I suppose that finally brings us to a question of what do we mean by transformation? If we think reparative justice should be delivering to us transformative politics, a new world, can that be achieved through the politics of aid? And I think that there are possibilities of developing or allying reparative justice to discussions of aid. We could be looking at global funding for new forms of institutional formations at a global level. We could be thinking of much more radical ways in which we could have collective movements around funding, but also the dispersal and the discussion about what kind of alternatives local communities might be thinking about when they're thinking about how to recover and how to move on from their histories of colonialism. But at the moment, I don't think that we have those kinds of radical debates. We don't have enough of a roadmap towards achieving those radical restructurings and transformations of the global economy, but also of the global institutional structure in order to develop and to deliver that kind of social justice at a global scale that's required.
Thank you, Professor Price. And finally, over to Professor Wells.
Hi. So my research is on international development as it intersects with childhood studies, which is to see how kind of international structures and flows and processes shape childhood, shape children's lives, and shape the way that people, adults and children, think about what childhood should or could be. So my work isn't directly connected in a or reparations. And when I was invited by Ben to contribute to this panel tonight, I was trying to kind of think about, well, from a sort of, my background's actually in international relations, and my training therefore is very much about viewing aid as part of state policy and viewing aid as a foreign policy tool. And I think it's necessary to locate aid in that dimension, because it then immediately strips away any of the kind of, one might say, fantasies about what aid can do and what aid is for. Aid is definitely a foreign policy instrument, and it's states that organise it either as bilateral or multilateral actors or in concert with international organisations. And therefore, the first question, in a sense, we have to ask, I think, is in any particular formation or moment, what work is aid doing, and what is it intended to do by those who are distributing it, who are trying to secure their foreign policy goals, and what are those foreign policy goals? And so that's one kind of set of questions. The second set of questions, which I've obviously been, as perhaps all of us have been, very preoccupied with since October 7th, is the genocide in Palestine, and how we can think about aid and reparations in that context, like how we can understand the work that is being done by aid and has been done by aid over the whole period of the establishment of the Israeli state and its constant assault on Palestinian life and land. And so I guess what I wanted to kind of talk about tonight a bit was that context and that relationship, and try to kind of think about, I mean, this question of how can we champion aid and reparations feels almost naive, because it presumes in the first place that these two things, well, certainly this one thing, aid, reparations comes from a different discourse, but if reparations is going to become an economic reality, then it's going to have to be somehow supported by the world's states. And I don't think I'm alone in thinking that's not happening anytime soon. But the other thing I wanted to say, I'm sorry, I know I'm kind of like circling around a lot of issues here, is like when you said, oh, everything changed when Trump was elected to the second administration, no, it didn't. This is just a continuity of US domestic and foreign policy. And yes, Trump is in many senses a kind of particularly unveneered version of that, but remind ourselves that for most of the current assault on Gaza, which has now cost the lives of 17,500 children and 45,000 other civilians, that A, started long before October 7th, 2023, and B, for most of that, it was a democratic administration that was in power in the United States, and they consistently said one thing: Israel has the right to defend itself, and therefore we're going to fund Israel to the tune of millions of dollars in order to support this so-called defense, which was in fact an assault on Gaza. You can then tie that to a moment back in 2018, I think it was in the first Trump administration, when Trump withdraws aid from UNRWA in order to put forward, I can't remember what he was called now, he's just such weird adverts, but it's Perfect Plan for Peace, something like this, right, in Israel. And basically the aim of that was to force Palestinians or Palestinian representatives to accept not only a two-state solution, but in fact to accept Israel's expansion into Gaza and the West Bank as a de jure sovereignty over those territories. And it used aid, specifically used aid to do that. Right? That was in 2018, I believe. Okay, so Biden did reinstate that aid when he came to power, but he then, you might remember, some months ago, Israel made an accusation that UNRWA was an instrument of Hamas. By now, a familiar refrain to every war crime that Israel commits. And its evidence was that 12 people out of an organisation which employs thousands of people, the 12 people were affiliated to Hamas, and therefore these countries, the USA, Canada, the UK, should withdraw their aid from UNRWA, which they did. This happened not under the Trump administration, this happened under the Biden administration. So this is where, I mean, I think as anybody in IR knows, the consistency of foreign policy objectives continues regardless of governmental change. And that's what you're seeing in the United States. I'm not saying that in some respects, and perhaps in respects of domestic policy, particularly around Medicare, Trump is different. But in this respect, Trump is exactly the same as Biden and exactly the same as all the other administrations prior to that, right the way back to 1948. And so we cannot but see aid as a tool of foreign policy, and therefore we have to say it's never linked to social justice. And perhaps, and this, I understand your point about the contradiction, right? Because there's a left and a right critique of aid. And the left critique has consistently said it's a foreign policy instrument. And the right critique has basically said, why should we pay for other people's problems, essentially, you know? And despite the fact that they align, and obviously this makes us anxious, and the fact that when Trump withdrew overnight US aid, that I agree with your point, thousands of people were cut off from absolutely necessary life support, literally in some cases, like the withdrawal of UN aid from aid, you know, from HIV positive, for threat and for antiretrovirals. This literally is putting people's life at risk in a very immediate way. And so these problems also have to be addressed. Like, and we have this real, I think, conundrum. I think that what we can say is that we don't necessarily want to call for the end of aid, but to tie it to social justice, I think is a very dangerous route. I think we have to recognise it's part of a foreign policy goal, and in that sense, we might be able to make arguments about why certain forms of aid need to continue in order to secure some of those objectives. And we could also then say in relation to Israel that the objective of the United States and the European Union since the inception of Israel has been to secure that state's existence at any price. And it has thrown £40 billion into UNRWA to secure that over the lifetime of the state of Israel, just to secure that. And that's what that aid is going to do. We have to recognise that. And then we have to, I think, you know, when you first asked me about this, I was like, the entire international system is literally melting before our eyes. You know, like, where are we now? It's like coming up to 3 years, like 2.5 years. And since it started, right? Is that right? 2.5 years now? And it's like, when it started, I mean, obviously I'm a socialist. I'm completely a realist in relation to foreign policy objectives of the major capitalist states. But I still actually thought that the international system meant something, that there was some scope for international law and regulations to restrict the free range of even hegemonic states. And that the entire architecture of the post-war settlement depends on that being in existence. It has all gone, all of it. There is really nothing, there's no constraint on this actor. And that means there's no constraint on the United States, there's no constraint on the UK, there's no constraint on the EU to act always and only in its own interests. And I feel like we're at this absolutely terrifying moment, to be honest. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think I'm going to stop.
Thanks so much, and thank you everybody for three kind of really different perspectives there. So how I was going to do this, I was going to ask for questions from the room first, maybe take them in groups of 3, and then we'll go online, and if anybody can type any questions in the chat, we'll do it like that. I'm going to pass the microphone around. To switch it on, you just need to press the little red button underneath there. Who wants to go first with questions, thoughts, ideas?
Thank you very much. It's just so helpful to hear those different perspectives presented in this way. There's one question that I have related to this radical approach, radical thinking. I'm curious as to where you think that might come from, particularly when we focus on where we are with the right. I'm wanting to know whether your thoughts about this radical movement, radical thinking, particularly in relation to reparative justice. Where would this come from? Would it be from governments? Would it be from us, people, the sector? I just want to get a sense of what we could be doing right now. There's so many debates, so much which is going on. Have we lost the plot with regards to the nature of that practice?
That's a great question. In fact, I said I was going to take questions in 3, but I think that's such a big question that I'm going to hand it over to you now. And I'm also going to speak rather slowly to give you a few seconds to gather your thoughts. I mean, one of the things that you've all said in some senses, I began with what I thought was a reasonably bleak introduction, but you all kind of went a bit further than me, really. And I think one of the things that's really kind of jumped out from what you've all said is the way in which these problems are so deeply intertwined within the global system, the institutions, the knowledge, and the way in which even the good is kind of instrumentalized into something that isn't so. So, and I mean, maybe reflecting back to what Sophia said about the 1970s. So where is the kind of glimmer of hope, and where are the radical ideas going to come from? And maybe we'll go Patricia, Sophia, and then Karen, if that's okay. Patricia, do you have the microphone?
I suppose I agree with you about we shouldn't mix aid with reparative justice. I think there are different arguments for it's best to keep them apart, really, because they are we're not the descendants of enslaved people are not asking for aid.
Yeah.
So that's and the way aid has been characterized in the West as is something that is given to impoverished people, who are unnecessarily deserving, or probably undeserving now. So that's and that's not the case. And I think you presented. Your presentation was great about how much it's linked to foreign policy. If you look at aid anywhere, even in some of the poorer countries, even in humanitarian aid, how much aid is given. And I mean, I always look at the pledges and how much is actually received on the ground.
Yeah.
Because at that, they might pledge a lot of aid, and actually a small fraction of what government's pledge is received. Yeah. Now, let me turn to Jan's question about radical thinking. People since that radical thinking has been ongoing since the 1970s. It hasn't disappeared. NEI there was an attempt to promote a new international economic order through the established institutions of the UN. And of course, that didn't work because we were at a juncture at the time. As you say, probably that's why you made the link. It was that we're at a juncture where there was a lot of oil wealth in one part of the world, and also people were, there was capitalism was restructuring, and those who could have made a difference. In fact, what happened was, as you said, the radical ideas were co-opted and reconfigured, and that didn't result in any major change. In fact, we went straight into structural adjustment and then neoliberalism. But those radical people have been articulating those radical ideas right up to the present, and certainly reparations. The debate has, it's not something that's new. It's there have been scholars, activists working, in the field of reparations for decades now. It's just that at this particular moment, and particularly, I would say after Black Lives Matter, there was a resurgence. People wanted to know more and wanted to hear. But that discourse, that discussion has been going on, and I think it will continue. With regards to, I think what's different also about from the 1970s is that we have BRICS, we have and it could be, I mean, I think the question mark is out, and you are people, so you might know more than me, as to whether BRICS is can be radical. At the moment, there's not much sign that it is, going to radically restructure the world economically, but it means that there are alternatives, and that's why I think the US, both Biden and Trump administration become so hostile towards China or to any possible alternatives for the rest of the world that they want to control. I think as an academic, I think we academics need to continue to do research. Research is, I mean, obviously there's an attack on science, there's an attack on academics. And, I was reflecting when I came here, I went into Dillon's, and when I was here as a student in the 80s, Dillon's, all the academic books were on the ground floor and in the first floor. Now they're on the third floor. Obviously you can get them online, but it's also a sign that people are not interested now in reading, academic texts. But that doesn't necessarily mean we should stop researching, reading, and actually translating those texts into publicly accessible text. Right? So that's one. The other issue is, of course, I think the people will make a difference. People always make a difference. Uprisings don't come from people at the top. They never do, because they normally want to maintain the system. And if you look at revolutions, they start on the ground. They start with people, small groups of people coming together. And those groups build and build and build. And I think that will happen because the situation is going to get worse. Sorry, so but the situation will get worse. I mean, I think what we're going to see is a shift, and I worry like you that we're going to see, sort of rogue states, or what people call them, more rogue activity by states, because the UN is unable to act in a collective way to control them.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question.
Sophia, is the mic on? Can we just check
is
it?
it on?
Yes.
Sort of hold it. It's a great question. I suppose when we're looking at, where the big calls for reparative justice are coming from, there's institutional calls, and we can see the CARA Forum and the African Union, for example, as regional organisations who have taken on a very radical agenda, and that looks, like a real moment of radical politics. An institutional forum brings together the states and who are openly talking about the need to guarantee reparative justice for the Caribbean or for Africa. I think this sort of points to a bit of the contradiction that I feel, right? Because the CARA Forum, while at the same time as calling for reparative justice, has been a whole-scale adopter of free trade. It's a massive partner of the European Union. It was one of the European Union's first partners to embrace free trade through economic partnership agreements, which are very controversial, and parts of Africa have been able to resist those kind of free trade imperatives. But the CARA Forum has adopted free trade fairly in a whole-scale way, and the calls for reparative justice has come at the same time as the Caribbean has become less central to aid politics, as there's been a retraction of aid. So I think that there is a kind of instrumentality that goes on there. I don't think that's the only reason it goes on there, but I think that there is this kind of adoption of radical politics in order to push forward state agendas, right? State agendas exist, within African states, within Caribbean states, as well as European states, right? These are state-led agendas, I'm less keen on this kind of BRICS moment. From an IR perspective, a multipolar world is a much less stable world, and if we're looking at the agency of China as being a key state within the BRICS alliance, then there is real worry about the agency of Chinese investment and Chinese aid into Africa, the appropriation and exploitation of working populations, the appropriation of natural resources, the plunder of critical raw materials. All of those things are particularly worrying, although the Chinese finance does offer an alternative to the kind of coercive Western forms of finance that we've seen. But I am not wholly pessimistic, because there are really strong movements for radical politics that are happening right way around the world. And I think that that is a moment of real optimism. If we see in kind of Pan-Africanist movements, not necessarily the institutionalized form of Pan-Africanism, but the ways in which those critical debates are openly being discussed within a range of different communities. I have the absolute pleasure of working at the University of Johannesburg, and that is an environment where people are radically engaging and talking about transforming the global economy in a radical politics, which gives me some hope, right? And so I think that there are, you know, communities out there that are able to discuss colonialism, to discuss reparative justice, and those conversations are happening on a global scale in a way that perhaps weren't happening 10 or 20 years ago. So our ability to be able to talk about this, to be able to construct a new politics, a new radical politics, is there, but we can't rest on our laurels. We can't just be happy to be having those conversations. And we have to be critical of those conversations. It's not enough that we talk about social justice. We have to start fashioning what we mean by social justice and how to achieve it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sophie. Karen?
So I mean, I guess I'm incredibly pessimistic at this moment about where any of these radical currents can come from. I teach a module called Riots, Rebels and Revolutions. And it is true that the 21st century is one of the most revolutionary centuries so far. There have been lots of uprisings, revolts, revolutions. They haven't really succeeded in kind of shifting like the global, either the national or global structures. But nonetheless, they do show a kind of certain energy towards political change that can be. And I agree with you, Patricia, that, you know, it comes from below, it comes from a mass of self-organisation, and it's always unexpected. One of the great things about revolutions is nobody ever sees them coming. So that's all to the good, but the reason I feel quite bleak at the same time is because I also feel that I don't think it's alarmist to say that we're facing fascism, and that one of the kind of the real dangers of the current moment is precisely that as things fall apart, the material, the ideologies, the practices that come to fill that gap are fascist. You know, that's what we know historically, and that's what we're experiencing at this moment. And so it is really important that we, you know, we develop ideological positions that can kind of talk about how we want to live otherwise, like how we can live outside of this moment, how we can develop new kind of social, political and economic entities. Absolutely, but yeah, that's definitely important. I was thinking about, I'm preparing a lecture right now on the South African Communist Party and the ANC, and the lecture's called A Failed Revolution but a Successful Insurgency. And the reason I called it that is because, you know, it looked like the majority rule looked like a huge win, and in many ways it is a huge win, right? But the inequalities in contemporary South Africa are, as you all probably know, extreme, and in many ways, the majority of the population, Black South Africans, have not got the economic gains or even many of the political gains that they would have hoped for, did hope for, when apartheid ended. And the reason I focus on the alliance between the South African Communist Party and the ANC is because that was the point when there was, in the mainstream, you know, communist, socialist ideas about how to organise economics and politics, and something to do with the end of the Cold War. Definitely contributed to the neoliberalism of the ANC subsequent position, you know. But the other thing I was really interested in, I was listening to a lecture by a guy, in fact, a Black British historian who did his PhD here at Birkbeck, and now teaches, he's a professor now in South Africa. He wrote a book on the Conte Race Sizwe, the armed branch of the ANC. And in his lecture about that, he describes all of these like international connections. You know, like Mandela went to China to get trained to fight for MK. Then the party was like, you know what, I think Algeria is a better model. And so then Mandela goes to Algeria to learn how to fight the guerrilla warfare, you know, and there's all these socialist communist South Africans, like, you know, once Vietnam was won, that opened up a whole new front. And so, you know, it was a bipolar world in quite a different way than the Brits were offering us. You know, let's not forget that India is on the way to fascism to Russia. Brazil had exploitation, it's now gone back to the left. I mean,
Thank you. Okay, one more question from the floor, if that's okay. There's a few questions coming in the chat online, not to forget everybody online, so I'll switch back there. But sorry, there was just one question down the front here, Jan, this gentleman. And then we'll take your question at the back as well afterwards, if that's okay.
Right. This question is directly to Professor Daley, actually, in the sense that Professor Wine from Cambridge, she now teaches in JNU in India. She has very scientifically calculated that the transfer of wealth during colonialism from India to Britain is around 50 trillion, right? So, and that doesn't even calculate the amount of money that has been extracted from there. So, and then it is being reinvested or invested in settler colonial countries. So that is purely from Britain itself. So I might probably know about the literature. My basic question to you is that how does that situate of compensation versus reparation? Because we don't call it reparation. I mean, we call that why not give compensation? If you give compensation, just imagine how much developed India would be, because the institutions, quite a large chunk of the institutions have already been well developed right now. That is the first question. And the second one quickly is for the rest of the group is that you have talked about, Patricia has talked about transfer of capital. Yes, but what about the transfer of human capital? Because there is a very big movement is going on from the left. The right has been trying to say that how beneficial it is to the third world countries or developing countries or global south when the flight of human capital takes place. Now here I want to mention some. Ahmed Desai has said that nobody is talking about brain if it is only two professors here or two doctors there. We are here now talking about 20 million. 20 million from India alone is 10 million. So that kind of transfer of human capital has taken place. What do you think about the compensation? Do you think that should be compensated too? Because you want to stop the flight of capital. What about flight of human capital? So I mean that's enough, I think.
Two great questions. Sorry, I'm just going to come and grab the mic for this gentleman behind the close to ask the question. If you could, as well. All right. Thank
I want to bring something in. I think that the idea of BRICS is good because it means it's a breakaway from the neo-colonial nature of the global, the global economy, and also as the United States becomes more authoritarian, they're now inviting apartheidists into the southern parts of America, which means that that the promises made from the independence movements across the world hasn't been fulfilling some finished business. I do believe that we need a non-governmental organization like the United Nations, because in the end, it's an improvement from the League of Nations, which did take into account other groups of people around the world, like independence movements in China, the African continent, the Pacific, and the Central and the South America. I think we're in a world now, a world of consenting nations, instead of being in an imperial world of Western powers and their colonies. So I feel that if we don't start supporting economic initiatives like the de-dollarization and support BRICS, which is for the first time the global south beginning to become more organized and becoming more influential in the global markets and in the nature of globalization, then we're going to see another wave of neo-colonialism flourish as well. I mean, when you've got a situation where a bunch of apartheidists who have 5-bedroom houses and 2 dogs, and they leave their mother behind to go to America as refugees, there's something wrong.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you so much for the questions. Just to summarize, should we get one more question in? Okay. Right. So let's deal with these ones first then. This first question was just to Professor Daley about what about the idea of compensation and these numbers and figures that we're talking about, and then to all of the panel, what about the question of human capital? And let's revisit the question about the BRICS that seem to operate this kind of, as you talked on the panel, you had some kind of ambiguous views about what role the BRICS might play. So Professor Daley first.
Yeah, I noticed that many South Asian scholars who joined the debate for reparations. And I think that is good. And I think it will enrich the debate and it will add weight to the campaign that Africans and others have been conducting. But the atrocities, I think that's why we need more research. I know there were atrocities committed in India, and many of them have been downplayed. I actually was looking for images. I am publishing a book, and I wanted an image from colonial India. And I went on some of the free sites, and on one side, all I saw were war, people being killed, villages being, subjected to scorched earth and so on. It was horrific. And I thought, my God, apart from a few pictures of white people being carried in hammocks, the rest were all of violence against the Indian population. So, but that's for the Indians to deal with, or South Asians to deal with. We people, descendants of enslaved people, the atrocities against us being well documented. In regards to human capital, the removal of people from the continent of Africa over 200 years impoverished the continent. Right? What we're seeing now is another removal, right? Because African governments are told now that endogenous development is not necessary. Just export your people to Saudi Arabia or somewhere else, right? But you don't have to think about development projects that would use the productive capacity of your young people. Okay? So African governments are signing up to either send in their young men and women into UN peacekeeping forces to get killed, as in Haiti, or as virtually slave labor again in the Middle East and other parts of the world. And that is something we should be objecting to. With regards to, I actually disagree with you about a bipolar world was safer. than a multipolar world. The bipolar world was never safe for Black people or for Africans. Look at the number of wars in Africa since the 60s, right up to the present, right? Proxy Cold Wars, but also wars deliberately done to disempower and stop African countries from advancing. Right? With regards to China and BRICS, I do agree with you on the need to support de-dollarization, and I disagree about this emphasis on China or this discourse on China all the time in the West. I tend to spend a lot of time browsing on the internet, and I'm interested in really, although I'm not an economist, I'm interested in, as I said, agreements, looking at trade agreements, looking at what people are doing. And some of you might be familiar with Mark Curtis's report called The New Colonialism, Britain Scramble for Africa's Oil and Energy Resources, published in 2016. And he was talking about the Britain after the 2008 financial crisis and how British capital rushed to Africa to acquire land and energy. And he said 101 companies that are listed on the London stock exchanges are involved in mineral extraction from African resources, notably gold, platinum, diamonds, copper, oil, gas, and coal. Most of the companies are British, and mining operations in 37 sub-Saharan African countries. They collectively control over 1 trillion worth of Africa's most valuable resource. So if you actually look at the Chinese company, they are not actually, they don't control as much resources as the British. And since Trump has been elected to power, cutting off USAID aid, he's been signing agreements, right? The US have been signing agreements with the DRC, focusing on critical minerals. This May, Cobalt and an Australian company called ABS has reached an agreement to develop lithium mines, right? And the invested in Cobalt is actually Bill Gates. One of them is Bill Gates, and the other is Alex Bezos. So these Americans who are talking about providing, aid on one hand, people like Bill Gates, is actually invested in extracting critical minerals and resources from Africa. And I've been looking at all these agreements. Right? On the 27th of May, Democratic Republic of Congo unveiled a $58 billion master plan aimed at rebuilding and remodernizing its critical infrastructure as part of a broader $500 billion mega partnership announced with the United States. Right? And this is Trump you're talking about, who's hostile to Africa. I think you need to read, and also the agreement, Trump's diplomatic law in the White House with Ramaphosa. Again, have you looked at the trade agreement that was signed, which allowed Elon Musk to bypass the Black Empowerment Program? That is regressing back to apartheid in South Africa, right? So I don't want to hear people talk about China, right? When actually, the major debtors, the major investment people who are really rampaging across Africa are the Americans and the Europeans.
Yeah, I suppose that's for me to comment, isn't it? I completely agree with everything that you say. And what I'm not at all saying is that China is bad and American investment. It's that what I'm saying is that Africa has become a site of inter-imperial competition or neo-colonial competition. And I think it's dangerous to think of Chinese investment as being fundamentally better because it comes with no strings attached than European development cooperation relations or the US. I think they're all playing exactly the same game. And actually, you're absolutely right to focus on DRC because DRC is a site of competition, of neo-colonial or inter-imperialist competition, however you want to theorize that, both competing to be able to extract raw materials out of DRC. And the way to understand that is not only through trade relations, but also to look at how aid is being invested into the infrastructure designed to export critical raw materials, yes, out through Dar es Salaam, through the Chinese supply route, but also EU and American investment, ensuring that there is supply routes going out towards the western coast through the Lobito corridor. And these are reinvigorating colonial infrastructures that had been left and degraded, and they're now being reinvested in to reproduce those extractive economies that we understand as being colonialism. So I completely agree with you, but I think these are dangerous times. And that's where I would slightly disagree with Karen actually, because I think we have to understand, yes, it's state strategy, but we cannot divorce state strategies from a thorough understanding of global capitalist economy. And this is not just about foreign policy, this is about expanding accumulation networks and the global market, right? So I think we have to locate all of these forces within a thorough, and I'm agreeing with you, we need to locate all of these forces within a thorough and detailed analysis of the global economy, trying to disaggregate these kind of different phenomena. I think isn't helpful. We need to have a much more holistic approach. And obviously, you know, in response to your question about human capital, I completely agree with Patricia. You know, remittances has become a tool of development assistance, right? You know, there are ways in which we can celebrate workers moving away and being able to send money back to economies, and some economies in the global south are wholly reliant on remittances, which is but at the same time we need to recognise that that has a huge human cost. It has a human cost on families, it has a human cost on the productive capabilities within the sending state, but it also is a highly gendered labour market that operates at a global scale, whether it's for women working in households in Saudi Arabia, or if it's men working as labourers and being shipped out, often undertaking highly dangerous and awful journeys in order to be able to complete that circuit. So yeah, these are terrible phenomena, but I think we need to see these as interconnected within a much more holistic view of the global economy.
Thanks. Yeah, obviously when I say that, I see states totally tied up with supporting capital. So it's not that it's not like I'm saying, oh, there's the foreign policy of states, and then there's capital, and they're two separate, you know, sources of power. They're obviously intimately related. So, you know, the interest in Israel's security in the Middle East is entirely to do with capital flows, capital production, accumulation of capital, and you know, and on the question of anyway, yeah, and the point about de-development, I just wanted to kind of add this one in, is that there's a lot of research on UNRWA and the aid flows into Palestine, which explicitly show that the purpose of aid is precisely de-development. It's not to build productive forces, but rather to maintain a state of underdevelopment, as Rodney said, of course, about the European presence in Africa. So the question of this question of compensation, yeah, sure, but I mean, I don't know how that's going to get organised. I think one of the interviews said, like, it's going to take a complete reorganisation of the entire international political economy to make that ever, like, something that will happen. But sure, you know, we make unrealistic demands, you know, demand the impossible, why not? So this phrasing of people that leave their country as human capital, I really don't like, to be honest. Because I think it really, like, strips people also of the fact that they are individuals. You know, they have certain goals as well. This isn't the forced labour in the sense of indentured labour or enslaved labour, though there may be enslaved-like conditions, particularly in when people migrate without the legal support to do that, which means they then get caught in very exploitative and precarious situations, which can lead to something amounting to enslaved labour. But similarly, I think that, yes, you know, it's important to centre African actors in the negotiation of trade deals. You know, like Trump's making trade deals, Musk is making trade deals, Gates making trade deals. They're making trade deals with Africans. You know, that these are African corporations, African capitalists, and that also needs to be brought into the conversation, you know, and kind of take it, you know, and the full kind of complexity of that, you know, investigated and understood. On the question of the BRICS, I mean, I can't support them or not support them. You know, they're state actors and they've got their little coalition going, and it will do whatever it do. I've got nothing against dedollarization. I frankly think that the US is about to collapse. I mean, I think we're looking at end of empire in the same kind of, you know, the last days of the empire. Like, I really think that the States is about to collapse, and like, you know, good riddance. So, but I think also, like many of the conversations we're having today, you know, from the transatlantic slave trade to the current genocide in Palestine, you know, I think what it really lays bare is that this whole thing is rotten all the way down, you know, and that we every now and again we kind of like put our faith in some new manifestation of what looks like a possible pristine future within the current system. It's not attainable, and so not that means that we shouldn't try to improve our lives in the meantime and carry on struggling. China, again, I've just finished a lecture on China and the Chinese Revolution, its contributions to development. I think it's absolutely fascinating the way that China gets talked about. It's this kind of pariah rogue state that's like sucking the life out of the global economy. I mean, China's lifted more people out of poverty than any other country in history, well, yeah, possibly that too. It's also got one of the biggest sustainability programs in economic development. You know, like it's investing heavily in renewable energy, building entire cities like entirely run on renewable energy. It's a really interesting place, and like I don't know if it's like, you know, this debates about kind of state capitalism. Is it state capitalism? Like what's happening to all this private profit? Some of it, of course, is going into private hands. A lot of it isn't. You know, and so it's a very interesting situation. I know a lot of people. I work in West Africa. A lot of people are very suspicious about the Chinese presence, and with good reason. You know, like private-public partnerships could well blow up into a full-scale kind of ownership of China of African land, African infrastructure. So there is certainly reason to be cautious, but I certainly think it's. You know, it's doing some very interesting things. I think the other thing that it does, which is very interesting, which of course everybody does, is this. I was in Ethiopia like 3 years ago, and there's a lot of Chinese investment in Ethiopia now, and a lot of slogans in both Amharic and English and Chinese about like our brothers, our comrades, this revolutionary process. It's really interesting the way that language is continuing to be deployed of kind of like third world internationalism almost, you know. And on that note, social justice, you know, like, is it even a term we should still be using? When Theresa May can stand up and say the Tory party is a party of social justice, words have lost all meaning.
Can I just say, focus on China also stop us from looking at other actors, such as the UAE, such as Saudi Arabia, such as Turkey. It's not just China that is spreading its influence and its money across the continent.
Yeah, absolutely. They're very important, especially right, in relation to Saudi and West Africa. Saudi's influence in West Africa is very.
And East Africa.
Right, I'm just going to, there's so many questions I've got to ask, but I'm going to hold back my chair's prerogative. I just want to thank everybody who's been listening online as well. There's two really good questions here that actually kind of link to each other, and afterwards, if it's okay, we'll come back to you. William asked, can the panel speak to the relationship between reparations, ethics and power? The legal and ethical basis for reparations for enslaved African descendants is clear, but can it be realised without these groups having sufficient political and economic power? Now, the second question from Claudia kind of links to this. My question is, given the current climate, both economic and political, that we're looking at worldwide, I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts on how we engage the younger generation in the fight for reparations. How can it be done in terms of power? And then how particularly can we engage younger and maybe, to put it a different way, newer groups of political actors into the process? And I think this time I'll start with Karen and then move in the other direction.
Oh, okay. Well, in relation to William's question, I think the short answer is no. Without political power, even not secure political gains. So, but yeah, I agree the kind of legal cases seem pretty tight. On the question of engaging the younger generation, this is one of the few things I feel kind of hopeful actually, because I feel like, you know, sort of 15 years ago, maybe 12 years ago even, I used to teach I still do a lecture on Marxism, on international development, and I only did it because I'm so stubborn, and like nobody was interested, and people were like, Marx, what? And you know, or, oh, you mean Stalinism? Are you a tanky? You know, kind of like a real kind of dismissal, really, of any possibility of some kind of like state holding power for a cause that is socialism. And the kind of like, well, what I just talked about with the ANC, you know, like make crucial contributions to the armed struggle. And I feel like that shifted, you know, I feel like there seems to be a younger generation now. I don't know what generation you are now, Jane said, I don't even know. But, you know, who are really engaged in these issues of like interconnecting different kinds of struggles and trying to kind of, you know, even the shift of the environmentalist movement, which I think began as a rather sort of, you know, sentimental or kind of, you know, like here in Europe and North America, are kind of like almost like a play politics. A lot of it seems to be kind of encouraged by schools. But the people that came out of that, the young people that came out of that, seem to have really kind of thrown themselves into a much more radical politics and connecting environment sustainability to issues of ending racial capitalism, which, you know, that's nice. That generation is like taking on that pivot. So yeah, I have some hope there actually. I guess what I'm saying is that I don't think they need us to engage them. I think they already got there.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that there is a public discourse about colonialism and trying to understand that kind of historic and social context that wasn't there previously. And I think for young people, this is something that, you know, they engage with. So I am hopeful, but I'm also pessimistic. There's quite a lot of contestation and anti-progressive movements within, you know, all sections of society, not only young people, right? So I think we need to be really guarded against that, you know, and there's a whole set of kind of forces which are mitigating against that more kind of transformationalist moment for young people, you know. And there's quite a lot of public engagement by, you know, banks and breweries about trying to understand their responsibility or how they, you know, got to be rich through colonialism and all that kind of regret that people were saying about regret and sorrow and trying to, you know, throw light on it. And that's a fairly instrumental kind of moment. But I think that also is quite helpful for people to think about what is the responsibility of those organisations that they might be banking with, that they might be putting their money into when they go and buy a pint. You know, where you know, how does their world as consumers, as citizens, kind of engage with those organisations that frankly have profited historically from colonialism. And to William's question, I think that's kind of what I started with. I think that, you know, it would require such whole-scale reform and rethinking of global institutional structures that it's a massive task. And I agree, you can't reject that task because you can't imagine it. It was the that quote, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. You know, so we should allow ourselves the moment to imagine an alternative, but at the same time, we must recognise that alternative is not easily won, and it would take a huge amount of collective force. And I think That's why I'm very keen that we start thinking about what does transformation really look like, what do we really mean by social justice, and then start thinking about how we can make it happen.
Thank you. I'm very optimistic. I sit here as a descendant of enslaved people, and I'm sitting next to two people who were descendants of the enslavers. Right, probably not directly, but so this moment, yeah, and there might have been people at the time who thought it wasn't possible. Right? So it might not be possible in my generation, in my lifetime, but it's possible in the younger generation lifetime. I'd never say nothing can change. I think one of the things that's important in terms of bringing about change, and I'm talking about reparative justice in in a broad sense, not just financial compensation, is actually the independence of African states, and particularly the giant states in Africa, like Nigeria and South Africa. It's really important for them to become economically strong and independent and to solve their internal contradictions. Because without economic leverage, Africans have no major role on the stage. And the African Union has that potential, but it cannot play the role that it should play because it has been captured by neo-colonial forces. And for a long time, the West just ignored the African Union because they didn't want to have anything to do with African unity. African unity didn't interest them at all. But then once China built their, headquarters in Addis, suddenly they're all sending their representative and wanting to be involved. Right? And so they woke up, I suppose you could say. Right? So it's really important. African unity is critical to, or Pan-African, global African unity is critical to change, and we're working towards that. With regards to younger generation, I'm inspired by the younger generation. I teach in an institution where young people come from, many of them from very privileged backgrounds, but they're actually keen to know about how they can imagine different futures. Right? And so whenever I teach, I try to engage in what I call radical pedagogy. So we try to say, I teach on Africa, and I don't start with Europeans. I start with Africans who return. I don't start with European philosophers. I look for African philosophers as a starting point of any discussion I'm going to have with students on Africa. And that, for me, that's been a process for myself as well, personally, of unlearning. Europeans have not done any good in Africa. So why should we use their frameworks to understand the continent? So I go to them later because I want to show students how they have the damage they have caused through using European intellectual frameworks to understand. And it happens now with development. All the critical literature on development, I don't even have to tell you. So, development, ideas about development and transformation. And living standards can improve. China improved living standards. But we want to, we have other issues with China. Living standards in China have improved. So, they have transformed the continent. One of my former students who works in China came and said, the West doesn't realize, they could just, they don't realize how different China, really different China is from what the public discourse, There's so much investment in education, in science, in research here. It's just at a different level from what is happening here. And so I think for me, the problem for me with regards to young people is that young people in Africa, because of this emphasis on STEM that's been rolled out from the West, in Africa and the Caribbean, are not being taught their history. They're not being taught social science subjects, except for economics or probably entrepreneurship or something like that. Many schools have stopped history, and I think in there's a Ghanaian colleague over there. When I was in Ghana last November, somebody told me that, and I don't know how true this is, that the state curriculum in Ghana no longer teaches history to students. I mean, that is appalling. And so if you want to learn a bit of history, you have to probably go to a private school where they might teach it. So throughout, and when I was in Jamaica in December, I was talking to a 13-year-old and I said, oh, what history are you learning? She could recite all the kings and Henry VIII's wives, right? And and all sorts of nonsensical pieces of information about Henry VIII's wives, but she hasn't been taught anything about Jamaican history, right? So it's really important that we get back to promote, history and philosophy and the social sciences within our schools. And otherwise, I'm afraid what they want to produce are just robots, people who carry out simple tasks and then dispose. And we want to produce critical thinking people. And my students are interested in radical futures. They said, you can't just critique. If you read this book, really, the last chapter is all about, alternatives. Because the students said to us, but you're critiquing. Where are the alternatives? So it's okay, we're going to put alternatives in there. And we're going to get you to start thinking about them. And I think that's, and that discussion about reworlding and so on has been going on among Pan-Africanists, among decolonial scholars, and it's happening, and we're thinking. And what we need now is a political space and the economic space to allow that to happen. And it could happen in this moment, or it might not. Sorry.
I think we're gradually moving towards a slightly more optimistic sense. Let me see. Okay.
There was one question.
Yeah, just one, maybe just a final round of questions from the floor, if that's okay.
Thank you for the panel. I really appreciate it. There's quite a breadth of conversation happening. So forgive me for trying to grapple with a single question. I guess I'll come in as the optimistic American person here to bring us to the future. I'm having a little bit of trouble with the pessimism regarding Professor Price, talking about this radical politics, we kind of risk evolving into this, and Professor Wells, the question of power, that there's really not a chance for this huge transformative change to happen because the power structure is broken and imbalanced. And I'm coming from the US, working on the task force for reparations of the Boston Mayor's Office, where supposedly we're engaged in a comprehensive report on the legacy of enslavement, and a suggestion to the Mayor's Office about what reparative justice could look like economically and across different areas. I'm also positive because Chicago just announced that they're doing a very similar project and they're launching that at the end of this year. So my question is, in a world where the power imbalances are so stark and the conversation about reparations is so politicized, what is the role of a truly grassroots effort to account for the damage of enslavement? And is there potential then there to make a very specific legal argument about the damages of enslavement? As Professor Daley pointed out, people received reparations for enslavement. They were the enslavers themselves. And we can trace through research specifically the corporations and individual families that profited from that through time. Is there not a more grassroots opportunity that kind of circumvents this broader conversation about politics and thereby dismisses the conversation? Because at least in the US, this work is on, even with Trump. So thank you.
Just like 1 minute panel. And there's just one more question here, and then I think we'll round up with the last question.
Yes, sorry, I missed the earlier part, so forgive me if you answered these. But a few quick questions. One would be to Karen, Professor Karen. When you say that the US is about to implode, do you mean because of its economic policies it's about to implode, or because of other historical reasons? Because one reason I ask that is because if it's the economic reasoning, my position would be that economically the US can't implode, and that is it can have any kind of murderous economic policies, but the markets are always going to bank on the US. However good anyone else's economic policies are because of its nuclear capability. So the markets won't make an economic decision, they'll make a nuclear decision. And that will be in the US's favour, however crazy their lunatic economic policy would be. But on the other issue about reparations and slavery and all the rest of it, I think that last point is really important in that the only real reparations that slavery has produced are the reparations that were paid to the slave owners for dismantling slavery. That only really came out about 10 years ago, approximately. You know, that we were still paying tax to all the residues of all of that. That tells us something about objectivity, impartiality, and all of those great concepts that we were being taught with, because nobody knew about it. Certainly not in the public domain. But the question that I would like to ask is, when we're tracing the perpetrators and the kind of, whether it's slavers or colonizers, how do we identify people? Because one identification was made by the professor who said, well, she was sitting next to slave masters, or at least their descendants, and all that. And my view is that being white doesn't make you a slave master descendant. And the reason I have that view is, as I understand it, maybe I'm wrong about this, it was actually a class of white people that were slave masters. The overwhelming majority of white people in England were not slave masters. They weren't descendants of slave masters, any more than the Japanese who were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were actually responsible for the Tojo regime. I mean, they were innocent. Even if they were conscripts, they were actual conscripts. So how do we identify perpetrators?
Great. Okay. So just to summarise for the final set of questions, genuine grassroots action, and how does that happen? Really fascinating work happening in the United States. I think last week there's also an announcement about Tulsa and reparations there for the massacre at the beginning of the 20th century. And then over to the question around the identification, which loops back to questions about finance and how you go about deciding what kind of form reparations would take. And then maybe I'll leave you a question to you, Karen, as well, about why the United States may implode. So maybe we'll go Sophia first, and then Karen, and then Patricia.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the work at grassroots, is to keep those dynamics alive, right? Is to keep those conversations alive and to be able to throw light on those injustices. And so keep, I think there's, having been in Canada, where when you're in a public space, you recognise that you are on appropriated land. I mean, these are practices and performances that are really important in trying to make public aware, raise public awareness and keep public focus on that dynamic. So I think that work is important. In terms of colonialism, I mean, I'm not going to, I agree with what you're saying. Coloniality has an internal and an external dimension. In terms of driving forward the global economy, British Empire required labour to be moved into factories and to work in the most appalling conditions, where people died, children were put to work, So, I take your point, and I'm not trying to give an apology here, but I think that there is this, we have to recognise that the history of colonialism has an internal and an external dynamic, and those things are intertwined. And for me, the important dynamic there is class, but that's because of my own theoretical position and how class intersects with race and with gender. And I think that, understanding colonialism, we need to have a truly intersectional analysis, and that's that kind of holistic argument, and I think this kind of points to what Karen was saying, is that it's quite simplistic to see the global economy as the North exploiting the South. That clearly is a dynamic, but we have to understand how elites, how political groupings, how economic and social forces act within Caribbean economies, within African economies, to keep those conditions of exploitation happening. They do not happen in this contemporary era by direct control. There is deep social, political bonds and interrelationships of between different social groupings that keep those relations of exploitation alive. And I think making sure that we maintain a class dynamic and a class analysis within our understanding of colonialism is really important.
You speaking next?
Karen, yeah.
So great to hear the work you're doing. I'd like to know more about it. I think that if it's possible on some small scale, great. I think William's question was, I assumed that William's question was more, you know, the British Empire was, you know, enslaved, and the rest of the European empires, something in the region of 20 million people, and that the reparations for that need to be done at that level. Like, I think that's part of the call, right? If there, and also of course it's different in the States because there was enslavement in the urgent development of capitalism in the actual territory, you know, so there's also another dimension there. But yeah, I would like to know more about it. And that said, I think the thing about class analysis is absolutely critical, because I feel like sometimes a lot of the critique of capitalism recognises that it's racial capitalism, which is important. I think that's an advance on previous analysis of capitalism. But I think sometimes the class character of capitalism gets lost in that. And that needs to be evacuated, you know, excavated, because otherwise we're just going to reproduce a different form of, well, not even a different form, we're just going to reproduce capitalism. And, you know, and to some extent that's what happened in the wave of independence after the end of the Second World War, was that, you know, the ruling class left the territory, but the ruling classes that took over sometimes reproduced many of the class relations within that territory. And so I think that, you know, that also needs to be investigated. I mean, my point about the US implosion is partly flippant. Like, I don't know, I'm not an Americanist. I really don't know very much about the internal dynamics of the US economy, but it just seems to be ricocheting, you know, between one policy and another, and not just under Trump. Like, Biden's approach to Israel seems utterly incomprehensible, I think, to pretty much anybody that wasn't the central command of the Democratic Party. I mean, they were risking so much in terms of, you know, one of the things the US has always tried to do is represent itself on the world stage as a progressive force, right? As an anti-imperial force, as an anti-settler colonial force, irony of ironies. And here it is, just like funding a settler colony, like to the last penny, you know? By the way, I highly recommend soundtrack for a coup d'etat. Has anybody seen that? It's about the CIA's murder of Patricia Daley, but it's also about kind of, you know, the deep fear of Pan-Africanism in US foreign policy, and part of that fear, of course, is about communism. It's not just about African sovereignty over African territory. It's also about that African sovereignty de-linking Africa from the global capitalist economy. Was there another question in there on that? I didn't answer. Right, something I should have said. I didn't say.
Over to Patricia. That's okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. Yeah, it is heartening to hear about the reparative justice work that's been done in Boston and Chicago, and that work will continue. I don't think Trump. I think people be even more motivated. Those on the left anyway, and some liberals were more motivated with the Trump administration to do that type of work if they're allowed to. Because in an authoritarian state, they often, you know, things can close down very quickly. the Pan-African and the reparations movements got started as grassroots movements. There were elites involved in them, but it was grassroots that mobilized, women mobilized, and kept that movement going. So I think that will continue, certainly around at global Africa. Africans in whichever part of the world they're in will be mobilizing too, because it's important for them in all sorts of ways. With regards to the payment tax, compensation, it really upset me that I became a taxpayer in the UK in the 1970s. And it really upset me that a portion of my tax, even if it's 1 penny, have gone to the descendants of slave owners. That is terrible, really. And I deserve personally my tax back from the British government. I should actually put in an application. Particularly with regards to the question about the racial, the need for a class analysis. I always have a class analysis of what I do, but nevertheless, I'm very conscious of the fact that enslavement and the persecution and impoverishment has affected Black people since their encounter with Europeans has been justified along racial lines. And for that reason, I don't accuse me, as directly, but the fact that you are white and you symbolize whiteness, and I symbolize Blackness, and it's in that context that I am asserting my freedom, not because, but nevertheless, I think a class analysis is important. Elite capture of resources, but I have to say also, I'm from Jamaica, and the ruling class didn't leave. They're still there. They're all hotels. They're all sorts of businesses, and the Black population of Jamaica continue to be impoverished, very much dependent on what you described earlier, remittance. Right. So the ruling class is still there. Some of the Caribbean ruling class haven't moved at all. You just have to look at the families, the prominent families, business owners in Jamaica. They're mainly all white. I think there's probably only one Black multimillionaire in Jamaica. All the rest are white, and many of them descendants of slave owners, either from Jamaica or in the Caribbean and Central America. So that's still there. In Africa, some of them still own land. In South Africa, in Kenya, Mozambique, they still own land, and they're buying large tracts of land. So we still have that to contend with. So African elites, many of them are what we call compradors. But there are others also who actually end up being comprador. They start out being pro-people, but the circumstances that they found themselves in, the difficulty of any form of maneuver, the punishments that is exerted on them to the point, in some cases, of assassination, right, makes it really difficult for them, right, to stand up. And often they shift, and I've watched some shift their politics to become more complicit. And some of them are threatened, directly threatened. If you don't do this, right, then you will not get this, or we will do this. And therefore they retreat and start to promote anti-people positions and to steal, basically steal from the public purse. And that happens a lot. People will go in, even the people going with good intentions. So I'm not oblivious to elite capture, and I'm not oblivious to how we need to tackle them, but we need to tackle them the wider international sphere first in order to be able to make a difference. And we need to support those who are trying to make change. And as you probably are aware, there are a few African leaders now in West Africa who are trying to, promote something different, put in place something different. And they have been threatened. and then slurs against them, and public discourse is saying, they're, for me, they're military leaders, right? And military leaders are terrible. I have no, the military in Africa was set up to suppress people of Africa, and they haven't changed. Their goal is to suppress their own people, right? But at the same time, we need to think about how we can de-link, right, from the system that we're in. And Sammy Amin's book, De-Linking, and some of his discussions around that is really important, because we have to think of a way to get out of this system and to renegotiate our way back in or into a system where we have greater advantages and we're seen as equal partners. At the moment, we're not. All right, so it's going to be messy, and people might get more and more, some people might get more impoverished, but we cannot go, in many of those countries in the global south. I look at Jamaica, I just think, how can Jamaica survive? And if they don't have remittance, how would people there survive? The cost of living is even higher than as equivalent to the US. Food is incredibly expensive. So there's going to be a revolution somewhere, coming from somewhere.
We all need to do Karen's course on riots and revolutions. Okay, everybody. So we've been questioning the panel for nearly 2 hours. So I'm going to draw everything to a close now. Before I do, I want to say a couple of things. Firstly, we're in the midst, as you know, of the Social Sciences Festival. So there's lots of other events happening. Please do check the agenda. Tomorrow we have an event in the evening on food and politics, which is hybrid. You've also got a workshop, Karen, next week as well. Just to sum up what's been discussed, the panel have been amazing. You've talked about so many things. I haven't even been able to keep notes. It reminds me of the thing that I keep repeating to myself, which is you spend the first 20 years of your life learning history and the rest of your life unlearning the things that you thought you'd learn. I think you gave me lots of reasons to feel rather bleak about everything. The way in which, colonialism, exploitation, extraction is so deeply embedded in the history, but also, like you said, Patricia, the knowledge and the institutions around the world, and the way, and I think Karen said this too, the way in which, neoliberal systems embed this so deeply that how can we possibly have reparations when we have things like offshore regimes? But I thought you also gave me a few reasons to be kind of hopeful. This idea of the radical pedagogy, I can't say that word, radical teachings, and also the idea that there is shifts in kind of economic power, particularly in some largest and potentially powerful African countries, that could change the conversation in quite a significant way. Normally, I ask people on the panel to end with any book recommendations, right? But you've already given me lots and lots of book recommendations. So I'm going to list what I've learned. Number one is Learning Disobedience, which you can see here. Another very interesting work seems to be done by Mark Curtis from 2016, if you really want to understand how embedded these things are. There's also Soundtrack for a Coup d'etat.
That's not a book, that's a film.
Which is a film. I was just thinking of Stuart Reid's book, which is about the same issue as well. And finally, something that I have thought I'm going to go away and read, which I don't normally do, is trade agreements. Because I always just take them as read and never bother looking through the fine detail. I just wondered, finally, panel, if anybody has anything else that we think we should go away and read or watch or mobilize. I can't say any better than that. I want to say a huge thank you, everybody online. Huge thank you to everybody in the room, but most of all, a huge thank you to my panel. Thank you so much, everybody.